I've been working on air pollution particles, and we'd been measuring the magnetic content of those air pollution particles. So we knew already that there was an abundance of these strongly magnetic forms of air pollution. If we're walking down the road in a busy part of Lancaster, for example, there will be millions of magnetite nanoparticles in the air as we're walking along. So because magnetite is dangerous to brain cells, because it's very toxic to brain cells, and because the particles occurred in nanoparticle size, and because they're abundant in the urban atmosphere, I thought it's highly likely those particles are able to get into the human brain directly through being breathed in through the olfactory bulb. So it seemed unlikely to me that it would be possible not to breathe those particles into the brain. And so that's why we looked at human brain tissues to see could we find those self-same magnetic particles from the air occurring inside human brain tissues. When we looked at the brain tissue samples, we found two types of magnetite particle. So one type was this very nicely crystalline geometric shape. So they have been reported before. They are magnetite particles that form inside the brain through biological action. The other particles were very different. They were rounded, many of them. They often occurred in association with other metals that we don't normally find in the brain, including platinum and nickel and copper. These rounded particles were a range of different sizes, from 5 nanometers up to 150 nanometers. These particles look compellingly similar to rounded particles of magnetite that are abundant in the atmosphere from urban pollution. So they're rounded because they form at high temperatures, hundreds of degrees centigrade. They're essentially molten droplets of material, and when they're emitted into the atmosphere and they cool, they keep that rounded shape. So that combination of many of these particles, the spherical shape and the association with other metals that really shouldn't be present in the brain, that's what led us to believe these were externally sourced pollution particles in the brain. It's been shown that particles smaller than about 200 nanometers can actually make their way directly into the brain through the olfactory bulb by being breathed up through the nose and through the olfactory bulb directly into the cortex of the brain. It's likely that the blood-brain barrier can protect the brain from particles coming in the bloodstream, but there is no blood-brain barrier in this region, and so that's a pathway of vulnerability that we have to those particular nanoparticles. Magnetite is known to be very reactive, so it reacts with oxygen to form these damaging reactive oxygen species that cause cell damage and eventually cell death in the brain. So it's not just that magnetite is the only material in these particles, there are other metals, but magnetite is very toxic. So if people are actually exposed to these magnetite nanoparticles in abundance, and if it's toxic to the brain, then the likelihood is, it's very plausible, that these magnetite nanoparticles could be linked with neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease. It's been known for a long time that there is more iron in the Alzheimer's brain than in a normal brain. And it's actually been shown there's more magnetic iron in an Alzheimer's brain. In fact, the Alzheimer's tangles, they've actually been found to have magnetite inside those tangles. So the fact that magnetite is directly associated with Alzheimer's pathology is suggestive, at least, that there's some causal link. And until our work, it was thought those magnetites were forming inside the brain, but the possibility is that they have this external pollution source. Very recently there's been a large population study in Ontario in Canada where the epidemiological analysis shows that if you live within 50 metres of a major roadway, your odds of having dementia rise by anything between 7 and 14%. So there's increasingly strong statistical association between living close to major roads and your chances of developing neurodegenerative disease. What's needed now is much more work in order to understand if this is a causal factor for Alzheimer's disease. So that includes everything from testing the toxicity of these particles to human brain cells, to again looking at the epidemiological associations between exposure to magnetite and the chance of developing the disease, and perhaps developing other means of measuring how much magnetite people have in their brains in the living state, rather than just working on post-mortem tissues. Less than 5% of Alzheimer's cases are inherited, so the great majority of Alzheimer's cases, it's likely they're linked to some sort of environmental hazard, some environmental risk factor. So if you think that this is a possible route to later brain damage, why wouldn't you take every step to try to reduce it for yourself? And also, of course, put pressure on your MP to change policy, because it's only through those sorts of changes that the human health burden can actually be substantially reduced.